Hello. On this episode of On Subrogation, we're going to talk about the defenses of contributory and comparative fault. For On Subrogation, I'm Jason Sullivan, a partner at Rathbone Group, and most of our subrogation claims arise from tort. Tort is that fault-based system where the judge or the jury is going to try to determine which party failed to meet their duty of care and then cause damages to someone else. A common defense to this is, yes, maybe I was at fault, but so were you. And that's a defense the defendant is going to try and raise to say the plaintiff shouldn't be allowed to recover. Now, there are two main ways that this is handled in the U.S. The first is contributory fault systems, and the second is a comparative fault system. Two states that I'm licensed to practice in, North Carolina and Alabama, still use the contributory fault system. It's less common, but it's still prevalent in the several states. Under a contributory fault system, if a defendant proves that a plaintiff is at least 1% at fault for their damages, then the plaintiff is barred from any recovery at all. So take a common example where insured is driving down the road at a posted speed limit of 35 miles an hour. Now the insured begins to speed up and is traveling 45 miles an hour in a 35 mile an hour zone. The defendant is a vehicle that's pulling out of a private drive. They see the insured coming and they pull out thinking they have enough room. Of course they don't. They cause a collision, and now the plaintiff wants to sue for their damages. So when that insurer carrier is pursuing that claim, they're going to pursue the defendant on the basis that the defendant failed to yield when they pulled out of the private drive onto the roadway. The defendant may turn around and claim, well, the plaintiff's insured was speeding, they're also at fault. In a contributory fault system, if a judge or a jury were to find that that plaintiff's insured was at fault by the fact that they were speeding, even 1%, then they would be barred from recovering their claim. The contributory fault system is very rough on plaintiffs. It makes it difficult to recover because any percentage of negligence that caused their own harm is going to bar them from recovery. The second is more common, and that's a comparative fault. And comparative fault is broken into two different types. First, there's the pure comparative fault, and second, there's the modified. So approaching a pure comparative fault system, a plaintiff can recover for their damages even if they're at fault. No matter how at fault they are, they still can recover for their damages. The amount of damages are just reduced by the amount of fault that the judge or jury finds they have. Let's take that same example again, an insured who's driving 10 miles over the speed limit and is in a collision with a defendant who pulled out from a private drive into the roadway. In this case, let's say that the court found the 10 mile per hour over the speed limit was 75% of the cause of the collision, and the defendant who failed to yield to turn into the roadway was only 25% at fault. In a pure comparative fault system, the plaintiff or the plaintiff's insurer in a subrogation case can still recover their damages. However, since they were 75% at fault, the amount of damages are reduced by 75%. So a $10,000 claim would only result in a $2,500 award under a pure comparative fault system. A modified comparative fault system still allows a plaintiff to recover, but now there's a threshold. And usually that threshold's around 50 or 51%. And in those jurisdictions, similar to Ohio and Indiana, as long as the plaintiff is 50% or less at fault for the collision, they can still recover. So repeating that example where a plaintiff insured is speeding down the roadway and the defendant fails to yield, and a jury finds that the plaintiff's insured was 75%, in a modified comparative state, that plaintiff's insured is not going to be able to recover anything because 75% exceeds that 50 or 51% threshold. However, if the jury or judge found that the insured by speeding was only 25% negligent, then that plaintiff's insured or the plaintiff carrier could still recover on their claim because the 25% is less than that threshold. However, the total damages are going to be reduced by that comparative fault percentage. So again, a $10,000 claim with 25% negligence on the plaintiff's insured would result in a $7,500 recovery. Now, it's important to understand the distinction between these two, especially when you're deciding to litigate a case. In a contributory fault case where it's questionable, maybe there's some fault on the insured, a probable or likely outcome is that there will be no recovery. In the pure comparative, it's the exact opposite. Even if your insured is more than 50% at fault, you still have the potential for recovery, and you may want to analyze what's the likely outcome and how much would we recover. 10% of a claim that's a $100,000 claim is still a substantial recovery and may justify incurring those costs. Modified comparative fault gets a little more tricky because you have to think about exactly what that threshold is. And is it likely that the insured is going to be found more than 50% at fault or less than 50% at fault? And then, assuming there is some fault found on your insured, what's that likely fault, and is it still worth pursuing the case? Now, there's another state, South Dakota, that uses the slight comparative fault case, and in that case, a plaintiff can recover if their negligence is only slight. This is a lot mushier kind of standard, although there are several cases out there that do define what's slight negligence versus more gross negligence. But that's a unique state, similar to the comparative fault in that there can be a recovery, but it's what's that slight negligence percentage that matters. So if you have any questions on what the comparative fault laws or the contributory fault laws are for a state, please let us know. You want to know that information when you're deciding how to approach your subrogation claim. If you have any questions or have ideas for other video topics, please email us at video@rathbonegroup.com. For On Subrogation, I'm Jason Sullivan, and that's the long and tort of it.